"Whatever that girl carries, it is no heir of Ravenscar." The words fell across the open grave like a second coffin lid, and every mourner in that rain-soaked churchyard turned to look at her. Lady Cordelia Ashby stood alone where no widow should stand alone. 22, her gloved hand pressed to the child beneath her cloak, her husband not yet cold in the English earth. They had already decided what she was before they asked her name. But the old Earl of Ravenscar did not weep, and he did not flee. He turned upon the man who had spoken, slowly, the way he had once studied an enemy across a field of the fallen, and what he said next silenced the gossips entirely, for the general was hiding something, a secret carried across the sea, a key engraved with a single word, and only a dead man knew the truth. The rain found St. Albans before the mourners did, and by the time they lowered Julian Ashby into the cold seam of English earth, it was coming down in slants that stung. Not gentle, not the soft grief of a churchyard ballad. It hammered the lead of the old roof and drummed the coffin lid like an impatient hand. General Edmond Ashby, 6th Earl of Ravenscar, stood at the lip of the grave and held himself the way he had held 1,000 lines under fire, spine straight, jaw set, 65 years of weather in his face and not one crack in it where the world could see. He had buried men before, companies of them. Boys he had sent up slopes they never walked down. He knew the trick of standing at an open grave and showing nothing. Except the trick was built for other men's sons. It did not hold for his own 3 weeks. That was all it had been. 3 weeks since a fast horse and a worse stretch of the southern road had taken his only child off a hard bend and ended a quarrel Edmund had let stand for half the boy's life. There had been no last word between them. There had been no word at all, not for years. And now there never would be, and the rain could not rinse that arithmetic out of him, no matter how hard it tried. Behind him the mourners shifted in their wet black wool, and he heard them. Not the prayers, the whispers. The low currents of it, moving through the crowd like something that lived in walls, so sudden, so young. And the marriage barely a season old, and the girl. Look at the girl. Already showing, his jaw tightened by the width of the hair. That was the whole of the war he let them witness. Lady Cordelia Ashby stood a few paces off, alone where no widow should have to stand alone. 22, borrowed black gloves, because grief had come faster than her means could dress for. One hand lay flat against the curve beneath her cloak, as though she could shield the child there from the rain, the stairs, the whole cold weight of a room of strangers who had decided what she was before they asked her name. She had loved Julian. Edmund knew that much, though he had never managed to say a kind word to her in the few times they had met. She had given the boy the warmth his own father had rationed like a siege store, and there was the wound. Not the coffin, the rationing. Because the last conversation Edmund had granted his son had happened in a study, walled with maps and medals and every cold thing a soldier prizes. Julian had wanted to paint, wanted a small bright life full of color and quiet. And Edmund had looked across that desk and told the boy the one sentence he would carry to his own grave now. That the Ashby name was not a thing to be wasted on canvas and daydreams, that a man chose duty or he chose to be nothing at all. Julian had walked out, and in the silence that followed year after year, Edmund had taught himself a comfortable lie, that the distance was the boy's doing, the boy's pride. Never once his own, the vicar's voice thinned across the grave, ashes to ashes. Edmund had heard the words 100 times and only now understood they were aimed at the living. That ashes was the name for whatever was left of a man who waited too long to say he was sorry. He should have wept. Part of him wanted to go down into the mud and howl like the animal grief had made of him. Instead he counted. To 60, then to 60 again. The trick he had drilled into frightened recruits before a charge, because a man who can hold for one more minute can hold for as long as he must. It might have carried him through the whole black morning. It would have, if Tobias Crane had let it. Crane came through the crowd the way he moved through everything, smooth as poured oil, his coat somehow dry where every other man's hung sodden, a sorrowful expression arranged on a face that had never once felt the thing it imitated. He was his cousin, a distant graft on Edmund's late wife's line, the kind of relation who turns up at funerals the way carrion birds turn up at battlefields, summoned by the scent of what is about to fall vacant. And a great deal was about to fall vacant. A title with no living son to take it, an earldom a single heartbeat from open succession. Between Tobias Crane and everything he had ever wanted stood one small obstacle, the child beneath Cordelia's borrowed gloves. He stopped at the foot of the grave and did not trouble to lower his voice. That was the design of it. He wanted the dowagers and the gossiping baronets who had ridden out for the spectacle to hear every syllable. A tragedy, he began, that the line should end so cruelly. Edmund did not turn. The line does not end. Ah, Crane let the sound hang, bright and full of teeth, that yes. Forgive me, cousin, but a grieving man ought not lean on a fiction. He pivoted so the crowd could admire his reluctance. A wedding no one of standing witnessed. A union sworn in some country chapel with no banns, no settlement, no proof a Christian court would honor. And now a child conceived in haste and buried in grief before it's even born. He shook his head, the very portrait of an honest man pained by his duty. Whatever that girl carries, it is no heir of Ravenscar. Your name dies with your son, Edmond. The rest is a swelling belly and a tidy story. The crowd drew breath as one. Somewhere a woman gave the small, delighted gasp of a spectator at a duel she had paid to see. Cordelia made a sound, not a word. Something smaller and worse? The sound of the last firm ground giving way beneath a person's feet. And Edmond, who had not turned for any insult to himself, turned for that. He looked at Tobias Crane the way he had once studied an enemy battery across a field of the fallen. Slowly, without heat. Heat was for amateurs. You came to a grave, he said, and the quiet of it carried over the rain to do your accounting. It is the family's accounting, Crane answered. That duty compels me to protect, then have it read aloud. Edmund stepped to him. One step, enough to make a younger man reconsider. A coward measures a house the very hour its master is in the ground. You did not measure my son when there was a war he might have died in. You measure him now, over his coffin, with a lie in your mouth. He let the words sink into the mud between them. There is a name dying in this churchyard today, Crane. It simply isn't mine. For a breath it felt like a victory. The old lion roaring once more over his dead. But a lion is only as strong as the ground beneath him, and that ground had already begun to give, and Edmund could not yet feel it. Crane smiled. He actually smiled, and the smile was the coldest thing in that gray morning, because it belonged to a man holding cards he had not yet been forced to lay down. We shall leave the question of lies, he murmured, to wiser heads than ours. The courts, the bishops, the men who read documents and never weep over them. He inclined his head, all courtesy, the cruelty folded so neatly inside the manners that half the crowd would later swear he had behaved like a gentleman. My condolences, cousin, on both your losses. Both. The word slid in like a thin blade between two ribs, the son already in the ground, the grandchild not yet born and already, in the ledgers of the law and the drawing rooms alike, halfway to nothing at all. Then he was gone, back through a crowd that parted for him without hesitation, and the same crowd did not part for Edmund as it once had. That was the thing he marked as he gathered Cordelia to leave. Not the insult, the arithmetic of it. A Viscount he had known 30 years discovering a sudden fascination with his pocket watch. Two women who had danced at his wife's last ball, turning their painted faces toward the gravestones rather than meet his eye. A reputation, he understood then, is not lost in one great fall. It is lost the way a man bleeds from 100 small cuts, one averted gaze at a time. The carriage ran on through the wet country for a long while in silence. Cordelia sat across from him, small and rigid, hands folded over the child, eyes fixed on the gray fields dragging past the glass. Edmund had commanded thousands of men and found, sitting opposite this one girl, that he had no order to give. No tactic for grief, no campaign that ended in a frightened widow's trust. He carried it, you know, she said at last, not looking at him. Your silence. He carried it like a stone sewn into his coat. Every day I knew him. She turned then, and her eyes were dry, which was somehow worse than weeping. He never stopped waiting for one letter that said you weren't ashamed of him. The words went deeper than anything Crane had managed. Crane was a liar, and a liar's words slide off a man. This did not slide. It lodged. Because it was true, and the truth Edmund had learned far too late is the only blade that actually finds the seam. I was a soldier, he said. It was not a defense. It was barely a sentence. I knew how to forge men into weapons. I never learned how to let my son simply be a man. She studied him. Whatever she found, she chose not to spend it on cruelty, though she had earned the right. We have a worse enemy now than your regret, my lord, she said quietly. He has lawyers, and I have a country chapel and the word of a dead man. You have me. A small breath that was nearly a bitter laugh. Forgive me, but the last Ashby who relied on only you is in the ground we just left. He had no answer. There was none worth giving. He looked out at England, rolling by, sodden and indifferent, and let the sentence sit in his chest like a swallowed coal he would not be rid of for a long time. Cordelia spoke once more before the city closed around them, and this time her voice had changed. Less grief in it, more iron. They will try to make him nothing, she said. The child, they have already begun, and every soul who heard that man at the grave is at this moment repeating it at a better lit table than we'll sit at tonight. Let them repeat it, Edmund said. Words travel, my lord. She pressed her palm flat to the curve beneath her cloak, a small fierce gesture he would come to know well. Words become law if no one stands in their road. She looked at him with the directness only the very young or the very wounded can manage. Are you going to stand in their road? Or are you going to count to 60 and call your stillness strength, the way you did with him? It was a thing no junior officer had ever dared say to him, and no enemy had ever needed to. And it was, he knew, exactly right. He had spent a lifetime mistaking endurance for action, the held breath for the answer. It had cost him a son. He could feel, dimly, that it was about to cost him a grandson too, unless he learned in the few he had what he had failed to learn in decades. I do not yet know the ground, he admitted. A general who fights before he knows the ground buries his own men. He met her eyes and for the first time did not retreat behind rank or grief. But I am done counting, Cordelia. That much I can promise you between here and the door. She did not thank him. She was too sensible for that, and he respected her the more for it. She only nodded, once, the way a soldier accepts an order he will hold his commander to. And the carriage turned in under the dripping arch of the London house. Where Edmond did not yet know, the 100 small cuts had already gathered into something closer to a flood, and were waiting on a silver tray for him to walk through his own front door. The footman who met them had a face the color of curdled milk and a tray of small folded disasters, invitations withdrawn with elaborate regret. A dinner the Earl had been expected at, now grown suddenly impossible. A note from the family bank, the same house that had held Ashby money for 4 generations, requesting in the smallest and most poisonous language a moment of his lordship's time concerning certain accounts. And beneath the rest, folded to a single paragraph, the morning's paper. A paragraph that had not gotten there by chance. Edmond read it standing in his own hall, water still running off his coat. It is whispered, the thing ran, that the soldier Earl's recent and unexplained crossings to the continent were not the errands of a grieving father, but the desperate shifts of a man whose fortune has run dry. That a certain lady of Paris keeps a fuller account of the Ravenscar coffers than the Earl himself. A certain lady of Paris. He set the paper down very gently, which was the surest sign of how near he was to breaking something, because the gentler his hands, the closer the wall behind his temper had come to falling. He knew the lady the paragraph meant. He knew precisely what had passed between them across that cold strait of sea, in rooms his pride had never let him name to a living soul. And he knew, standing there dripping, that the truth of it would damn him faster than the lie ever could, so he had told no one. Not Cordelia, not Whitfield, not the boy he had crossed the water to save and arrived too late to tell. That was the trap, as clean as any he had ever set for an enemy. To clear his own name, he would have to confess a thing that looked, from the outside, identical to the crime they laid at his door. And to keep his silence was to let them shovel him into the grave beside his son. He understood, with a soldier's cold clarity, what Crane had done. The bank, the gossip, the lawyers, the planted paragraph, all of it arriving in the same wet morning his boy went into the ground. That was not a scavenger seizing a chance. That was a siege, laid carefully. Sprung these instant, the defenders were too grief-blind to see the walls being marked. Cordelia read the paragraph over his shoulder before he could fold it away. She did not flinch. A woman in Paris, she said, her voice level. Is it true? It is not what they mean by it, Edmond said. It was, he heard at once, a coward's half-answer, the kind he had been giving for years. He made himself improve it. There is a woman in Paris. There is a reason. It is mine to carry, and it is ours now, she cut in, not unkindly, only certain. You stood in the carriage and swore you were done counting. That lasted as far as the front door. She held his gaze. Whatever this is, my lord, they will use it to call you a liar, and me a fool, and that child a fraud, all in one breath. I would rather know the worst of you and fight beside it than trust a man who hides his powder from his own gunners. He almost told her that, the whole of it. He felt the words rise. And then the old habit closed his throat, the lifetime's reflex of carrying every weight alone and naming the loneliness strength, and he said only, soon, not tonight. Tonight I need one ally who still believes I'm worth defending, and I'm afraid the truth will cost me even you. It was, at least, an honest cowardice. She heard the difference. Then find your courage quickly, she said. The clock that's running is not yours. And she went up to a cold guest room in a house that had stopped feeling like anyone's home, leaving Edmond alone in the hall with a planted lie, a hidden truth, and the dawning certainty that the next battle of his life would be fought with weapons that he had never or once been trained to hold. He climbed to his study and stood among the maps, the campaign medals, the relics of the only language he had ever spoken without an accent. And for the first time in his soldiering life, Edmond Ashby looked at his own ground and did not know where to place the stone. The knock came near midnight, The door opened on a barrel-chested old soldier in a coat that had survived as many wars as its wearer, Major Thomas Whitfield, Edmund's right hand at 3 battles and his one honest friend in the long peace since. Whitfield had left an eye at a river crossing, whose name only the 2 of them still remembered, and he wore the patch the way other men wear a decoration, which is to say he never thought of it, because the truly proven never need reminding. "You look," Whitfield observed, lowering himself uninvited into the worst chair in the room, "like a man who's just at his own death notice." "Worse," Edmund said. "I've read my grandchild's," Whitfield grunted. He had the rare gift of saying nothing precisely when nothing was what a man needed. He let the fire snap. He let the rain run black down the glass. Only when Edmund had stopped staring at the maps did he speak. "I've made some quiet inquiries," he said. "The way you taught me. Your cousin isn't circling, Edmund. He's already cut your supply lines and posted the road behind you. The bank, the papers, the lawyers, every piece of it moving the same morning the boy went down. His one eye hardened. That took weeks to arrange. Which means Crane either knew your son was going to die, or he made very certain the moment one came he'd be standing over it with the documents already drawn." The fire cracked. Somewhere a bell counted an hour Edmund had lost track of hours ago. "Then I meet him here," Edmund said. "In London. In the open." "No." Whitfield shook his grizzled head slowly. "That's the field soldier in you, wanting the enemy in front where you can see him. But this isn't your ground. Down here he owns the bankers and the editors and the whole hissing parlor of them. Down here you're a scandal and a debt with a title attached." He leaned in. "Up north you're still the Earl of Ravenscar. The girl is safe there. And whatever the truth of this Paris business is, up there it has nowhere left to hide and no paid mouth to twist it. Ravenscar." Edmund had not said the name aloud in years. The old seat, the cold one. The castle on the high moor where the wind came off the fells with teeth in it, where he had carried his young bride a lifetime ago, and where, when she died, he had shut the great doors and walked out and never once gone back. Some houses hold a man's one good year. To return to them is to stand inside the ruin of it. He had let the place rot rather than feel that again. It's a tomb," Edmund said. "I sealed it the week I buried her. There's nothing up there but dust and the ghost of a kinder man than I turned out to be." "Then it's exactly where you belong," Whitfield answered, without a grain of sympathy. "Because a man fights hardest standing in the wreck of the thing he loved most." He rose, joints protesting. "I'll come. Someone has to watch the road behind you, and you've never once been able to do it for yourself." It was not a comfortable thing to be told. It was, however, true, and Whitfield had a veteran's contempt for comfort wherever it stood in the way of the truth. So the decision was made, not light, but in choice, and Edmund went to give the orders that would carry his family north before Crane's siege could close the last gate. They did not steal away. Crane and his lawyers would have liked the world to believe the old earl had bolted in disgrace. And Edmund decided to let them believe it, because a man who explains himself to jackals only teaches them his voice. He gathered the one person in London who still belonged to him, a strong box of his own papers he would not let leave his hand, and turned his back on a city that had turned its back on him first. The road north took the better part of 3 days, and with every mile the soft green country hardened. Hedgerows gave way to drystone walls, parks gave way to sheep, society gave way to sky. Cordelia watched it all with the wary stillness of a creature that has learned comfort is usually a snare, and Edmund did not crowd the silence because he had learned the same lesson. Only it had taken him most of his life to pass the test. They came to Ravenscar at dusk on the 3rd day, into a wind that flung the rain sideways like grape shot. The castle rose out of the moor exactly as he remembered, and worse for the years. A great gray carcass of a place, half its windows dark, ivy fisting at the towers, the gardens his wife had loved, gone to nettle and bramble. No light in any window, no smoke from any chimney. A house that had stopped its own heart the day its mistress was carried out, and had been waiting ever since for permission to beat again. The few servants who remained came into the courtyard like figures stepping out of a faded painting, pale and slow and amazed. At their head stood a small iron-spined woman near 70, in a black dress decades out of fashion, a ring of keys at her waist and eyes that had long since given up expecting good news through that gate. Mrs. Beswick had kept house at Ravenscar when Edmund's wife still laughed in its halls. She had stayed through all the empty years, tending a dead house out of a loyalty he had done nothing to deserve. When she saw him climb down, she did not curtsy at once. She simply looked, a long, level look holding every one of the years she had been left behind. "My lord," she said finally, "we did not look to see you again this side of your own funeral." "Nor did I, Mrs. Beswick," he answered. "Circumstance has made a liar of my intentions." Her gaze moved to Cordelia, to the gloved hand and the truth it rested on. Something in the old woman's face shifted, no warmer than the moor wind, but unmistakably moved. "And the young lady?" "My son's widow," Edmond said, "and she carries the only future this house has left." He heard his own voice stumble on the word future and despised it. "They mean to strip it from her in the courts. I brought her here because here, at the least, no one will tell her to her face that she is nothing." Mrs. Beswick was quiet a moment. Then she did a thing that surprised him. She crossed the streaming courtyard, took Cordelia's frozen hands in her own old ones, and said, with the fierce gentleness of a woman who has outlasted every kind of winter, "This house has been cold a long while, my lady. But cold is not the same as dead. We will light the fires." It was the first kindness in a fortnight that had asked Cordelia for nothing in return. And the girl stood dry-eyed through her husband's burial and her own public ruin, finally, quietly, in a courtyard at the cold edge of the country, began to weep. They lit the fires. That night, for the first time since a coffin had passed out through its great front doors, light moved again in the windows of Ravenscar. Small, stubborn, uncertain, like a single candle lifted against an enormous and patient dark. Edmond could not sleep. He never could the first night in a strange place, an old habit from a life in which the first night somewhere new was the night the enemy tested your pickets. He took a single candle and walked the corridors of his own past, and every room lay in ambush for him. Here his wife had read by a window, now blind with grime. Here, before the war and the coldness, a small boy had taken his first staggering steps across a floor. His father had been too far away to see. The house was a gallery of every gentle hour. Edmond had been too much the soldier to value while he held it. Now the gallery was all he had. Near midnight he came to a room he had not meant to enter. A small chamber off the east passage, once a nursery, and in the years before the rift the one room in any of his houses that had been wholly Julian's. He had forgotten it stood. The servants had kept it shut. The dust lay deep and unbroken, and the air had the held breath of a place no living foot had crossed in a long season. He lifted the candle. The flame fell across the leavings of a boyhood he had been too busy abroad to witness. A wooden soldier with one arm snapped clean off, painted in a child's careful hand. A shelf of cracked-spined books, not one of them concerning war. And pinned to the wall, its edges curling, a drawing, a landscape. This very moor, caught in charcoal by a hand that had plainly loved every fold of it, rendered with a tenderness Edmond had never once suspected his son to own. Initials in the corner, J.A. A date from a year the father had spent across the sea, killing strangers, while the boy stayed home and learned to see beauty in a country his father had only ever read as defensible terrain. His hand was shaking now. He let it shake. There was no one to perform for. On the small desk beneath the window sat a plain wooden box, the kind a boy keeps his treasures in. Edmond set down the candle and opened it, and what lay inside stopped his breath. Letters, dozens of them. Every letter he had ever written to his son across decades of postings and campaigns. The cold ones, the dutiful ones, the ones that inquired after the boy's progress as though reporting on a junior officer. Julian had kept every single one, even the cruelest. Bound in faded ribbon, read so often the folds had worn soft as cloth. Edmond had told himself, all these years, that his son had burned his letters. It had been the easier thing to believe. The truth was in his trembling hands. The boy had not hated him. The boy had been waiting, reading and rereading a hard man's hard words, hunting them for a single syllable of warmth, the way a starving man searches an empty larder. Finding none, keeping them all the same. There was something beneath the letters. Something small and cold that rolled against his fingers. He drew it into the candlelight, a key. Old silver, worn nearly smooth, far too small for any door in this enormous house, and along the worn shoulder of it, in lettering so faint he had to turn it to the flame to be sure, one word had been engraved by a careful hand. A single word. The last, it seemed, his son had left him. Forgive. Edmond Ashby sat down on the dusty floor of his dead boy's nursery. An earl, a general, a man who had buried whole armies dry-eyed, and he held a key he did not understand, stamped with a word he had not earned, and he wept as he had not let himself weep over the grave. Not for Crane's cruelty, for his own long failure repeated every day for years, until the one soul he might have said it to was past all hearing. And as the candle guttered and the wind clawed the towers, a question rose through the grief and would not lie back down. What did the key open? And of all the words a wronged son might leave a faithless father, why had Julian chosen that one? Winter did not loosen its hold on the moor so much as lose interest in it. Week by week, the snow drew back from the walls, like a slow tide going out, and what it left behind was a house unsure whether it had leave to live again. Edmond Ashby spent those weeks learning a craft no campaign had taught him, how to give a place back its breath instead of taking its ground. He was poor at it. A man who has spent a lifetime issuing commands has no idea how to ask a house to forgive him. So he did the only thing he understood. He set things in order. Not with his own hands, an earl does not swing a hammer, but with a commander's eye for what was broken and a stubbornness that unsettled the staff more than kindness could have. He had the great chimneys swept until the fires drew clean and tall. He had shutters thrown wide on rooms that had not tasted daylight since a coffin left them. He walked the dead gardens with Mrs. Beswick at his side and asked her the name of every ruined bed his wife had planted, listening to each one as though the answer mattered, which, he found, it did. Word ran down the moor road the way word always does, that the old earl had come home, that fires burned again in the windows of Ravenscar, and a young widow lived beneath its roof carrying the last of the blood. They came up in 2s and 3s, hat in hand, with eggs and mended linen and offers of honest work. Edmond, who had braced for the same averted eyes he had left in London, met instead a thing he had not earned and did not know how to hold: loyalty. Not to him, to the name, to the stubborn northern notion that some old houses are worth keeping warm. "That's the difference between the city and the dales, my lord," Mrs. Beswick remarked, watching a farmer's wife press a jar of dark honey into Cordelia's hands at the kitchen door. "Down there, a man is worth whatever they said of him this morning. Up here, he is worth what he was the day they buried his father." She paused. "They'll judge you slower, but they'll judge you truer." It was, Edmund thought, both the kindest and the most frightening sentence anyone had offered him in months. Because slower and truer leaves a man no shadow to stand in. Cordelia changed too, in those weeks, though she would have denied it under oath. The brittle armor she had worn through the funeral began, very slowly, to give way to something more dangerous. Hope. She took the reviving gardens for her afternoons. She let the old housekeeper fuss over her of an evening, and once, passing the music room, Edmund heard her singing to the child she carried, low and tuneless and entirely unguarded, a sound so full of ordinary tenderness that he had to grip the doorframe and remind himself he had no right to a single note of it. She caught him there, of course. "You're hovering, my lord. I am reconnoitering." "It's a hallway. It's my hallway," he answered. And something passed between them that, for the first time since St. Alden's, came near to a smile. He had begun in those quiet weeks to feel the dangerous thing himself. Not hope, he was too old and too marked for that. Something quieter. The sense that a man might be granted, against all his deserving, a second post after he has failed his first. He did not trust it. A soldier who trusts a quiet sector is a soldier who has not lived long. But he let himself in the warming evenings, sit by the fire while the girl sewed small impossible garments and the old woman dozed, and he let the silence of the place be a comfort rather than an accusation. He should have known better. Thaw uncovers as much as it warms. Under the melting snow of the home park, a winter's worth of dead things came back to the light, drowned voles and a fallen ewe, and the black bones of a hedge that had not survived the cold. And the same was true, he would learn within the week, of the thing he had carried north in his own breast and buried under all this new and borrowed peace. It did not stay buried. Such things never do. It waited only for the right innocent hand to turn it up, and that hand, when it came, belonged to the one person in the house who had meant him nothing but good. It was Mrs. Beswick who loosed it, and she meant no harm at all. She found Edmund one gray morning in the long gallery, before the portrait of his son painted at 16, in that brief season before war and coldness had made strangers of them. She stood beside him a while in the manner of two people who have shared a grief without once naming it. Then she said the thing she had been carrying. "He came home, you know, Master Julian. This past winter, just before the worst of the snows." Edmund went very still. "What did you say?" "He came north," she said, her voice careful as one lays down something that might break. "Alone. No carriage, no man, only a horse half foundered from the road. He asked for you. I told him you were across the water. On business no one here could explain to me. He didn't believe it at first. Thought I'd been set to turn him from the door." She swallowed. "He waited the better part of a week, my lord. Sat in the old study every day, with it shut. Then one morning he sealed the room, gave me the strangest instruction, and rode south again. We had the word he was dead before that snow had even melted off the high fields." The gallery seemed to lean. Edmund put a hand to the cold paneling. "While he was here, asking for me, and I was where, I never knew. My lord, none of us did. Only that you'd gone sudden in the night and left no word behind you, but he knew. He knew the precise rooms in a city across the sea, where he had spent that very week doing the unspeakable arithmetic that had cost him nearly everything, and saved a son who would die before he learned of it. The two of them had crossed in the dark. the boy riding north to forgive his father, the father sailing east to ransom his son, each reaching, after years of silence, across the exact span of days that guaranteed their hands would never meet. A whole life, Edmond thought, can come undone on a single piece of cruel timing. What instruction he managed. You said he left a strange one. Mrs. Beswick reached into her apron and drew out a heavy iron ring with a single old lock plate hung from it. He said the study was to stay sealed until a man came bearing the right key. She held it toward him. He said you'd know it the moment you saw it, and if you never came at all, the room was to stay shut until the house came down around it, the right key. Edmund's hand went, without his bidding it, to the breast of his coat, where since the night in the nursery he had carried a worn silver key, engraved with the one word he had not stopped turning over since, a general does not run. But Edmond Ashby had never in his life walked a corridor so quickly while pretending so hard to walk it slow. The certainty had come over him all at once, cold and total, the way certainty comes in the instant before a battle joins. His son had foreseen something. His son had locked the answer behind a door and betted on his father proving, in the end, worthy of one small word. Forgive. Not a reproach then, an instruction.
And the sun is gone.
A trust laid in the hands of the very man least likely to deserve it. He took the iron ring from her and did not look at it. He looked instead at the painted boy of 16 on the wall, at the half-smile the artist had caught, the one Edmund had spent the years since pretending he could not remember. I have wasted everything that mattered, he said very quietly, more to the portrait than to the woman. I will not waste this. And he turned and went, fast, toward the east passage and the swollen door at the end of it, while behind him Mrs. Beswick crossed herself and murmured a prayer for both the living man and the dead one, who had, she suspected, finally found a way to speak to each other across the only distance that had ever truly divided them. The study door had swelled shut with damp and neglect, and it took the two of them and the better part of a minute to force it. Then it gave all at once, and the held air of a hard season poured out, and Edmund stepped into the last place his son had ever stood as a living, hoping man. It was not a tomb. That was the thing that undid him. He had steeled himself for a tomb and walked instead into a workroom, alive with intention. An easel by the window held a half-finished study of the winter fells, the paint long dry, the ambition in every stroke somehow still wet, still reaching. Canvases leaned in stacks against the walls. A fat portfolio of sketches sat where a hand had left it. And on the desk, beside the stub of a candle, Julian himself was lit. Two objects waited with the patience only the dead can manage. The first was a small lacquered box. When Edmund lifted the lid, a thin silver tune unspooled into the quiet, a melody he half remembered from the nursery many years gone. On the underside of the lid, words had been carved by an adult hand, recent and deep, pressed as though the carver had needed to feel each letter bite. For the boy who only ever wanted his father's pride, he had to set it down. Some music a man cannot hear and keep his feet. The second object was an iron strongbox, squat and serious, the kind made to hold the few things a man cannot afford to lose. A small keyhole sat in its face, silver-rimmed and worn. Edmund did not need to try the key to know it would answer. He knew it the way a man knows his own pulse. He drew the worn silver key from his coat, and his hand shook so badly that Mrs. Beswick quietly withdrew and closed the door. Because some locks a man must open with no witness but himself. Forgive, the key said. The box gave, a letter lay on top. His own name across it, in his son's hand, the ink steady, written by a man who suspected he might never get to say the words aloud. Edmund read it once standing, once sitting, and a third time on the floor with his spine against the desk, and each reading took from him something he would not be getting back. Father, it began. They tell me you are not ashamed of me, but they are servants, and they are kind, and they lie to be kind. I have stopped needing you proud of the things I have done. I am asking for something smaller and far harder. I am asking you to be proud of the thing I am. Further down the sentence that broke him cleanly across the grain. I never wanted your medals. I only ever wanted you to look at the things I made and not look away. And beneath the signature, added in a different ink, on what must have been a different day, as though the boy had sealed it, and then could not bear to send it without one more word. If you are reading this, then I have run out of time, and you have run out of excuses. So forgive me the years I spent to read it, and forgive yourself the years you spent too proud to come. There is no one left to do it for us now. Beneath the letter the box held papers his grief-blurred eyes registered without truly weighing. A marriage line, signed and witnessed. A folded sheet heavy with a notice. Other documents dense and official, the language of law rather than love. He saw them, he did not read them. A man can only fall through one floor at a time. He gathered the whole box to his chest, the way he had failed to gather the boy, and carried it to his own rooms, and did not come down to dinner, nor the next day to breakfast. He should have read those papers that first night. Everything that came after might have run a different course if he had. But grief makes a poor clerk, and Edmond set the box on his table and let the most important pages of his life lie unexamined, because the letter had already emptied him, and there was nothing left over for ink and seals. The reckoning arrived 3 mornings later, not by weather but by post. A packet came up the moor road in the hands of a rider Crane had paid to ride hard. Inside every paragraph the cousin's money had planted in every paper that would take coin for column space, gathered and carried north for one purpose only: to poison the last clean well Edmond had left. Cordelia found the packet on the hall table before he did. By the time he came down, she had read every line. She was waiting in the cold morning room, the cuttings spread across the table like a dealt hand, and the face she turned on him was not the thawing girl from the gardens. It was the St. Alden's face again, only worse, because at the graveside strangers had wounded her, and now the wound bore the name of a man she had begun, against her better judgment. To trust, is it true, she said. No greeting, no quarter, is what true don't. The word came low and very level, which he was learning was her most dangerous register. That you were across the water this past winter. That there is a woman in Paris who keeps your accounts better than you do. That while my husband drowned in debts no one will name to me, his father was over the sea. She lifted one cutting between 2 fingers as though it were something already dead. Julian came here for you. You were not here. Now I learn where you were instead. Tell me it is not what they say. And here was the trap, sprung at last, exactly as Crane had built it. To clear his own name, Edmond would have to lay open the whole humiliating truth. That Julian had not merely owed money, that Julian had been ruined, wholly, by men who lend to grieving young artists at rates designed to swallow them. That the woman in Paris held those debts, and that Edmond had crossed the sea not for any pleasure but to mortgage his own free estate down to the boards and buy his son's ruin back into the family before the world could feast on it. To defend himself, he would have to call his dead son a failure in front of the boy's pregnant widow. He could not. He would sooner be thought a libertine than make Julian's grave a place of shame. It is not what they say, he managed. That much, I swear to you, then what is it? It is mine to carry, he said. Not yours, the wrong answer. He knew at the instant the words cleared his teeth. Because he had spent a lifetime carrying things alone and calling the weight strength, and the carrying had cost him a son, and here he was reaching for the same poison and giving it the same proud name. Cordelia rose, one hand bracing the small of her back, and the look she gave him cut deeper than anything since the grave, deeper because it was deserved. You sound exactly like the letters, she said quietly. He showed me some, you know, the cold ones. You wrote to your son for years and never once let him in, and now you will do the same to me and call it protection. She gathered the cuttings with hands that shook. You crossed the sea for your name, my lord. You could not cross a hallway for your son, and now you ask me to trust you with mine. She left him there. And the morning room, which had been merely cold, became something past cold, the particular emptiness of a room where a man has just lost the last ally he had and knows the fault is entirely his own. He stood a long while among the scattered evidence of his cousin's patience, holding in his breast the one secret that could have saved them both, and choosing again, for the oldest and worst of reasons, to keep it. Because silence was the only language he had ever been able to speak without trembling. Whitfield found him an hour later, still on his feet, still mute. The old major took one look, poured 2 measures without being asked, and pressed one into Edmond's hand, which was the nearest thing to medicine he had ever carried. She isn't wrong, you know, Whitfield said, about the carrying. I know what she said. I'm not repeating what she said. I'm telling you she's right. He drank. I've watched you do it 3 decades and more. Take every wound off into a corner like sharing it would be a kind of surrender. He set the glass down with a small, deliberate click. Out there, in the field, it kept you alive. Men followed you because you never once let them see you bleed. He fixed his single eye on his friend. But you are not in the field, Edmond. And in here, that same trick is digging you a place beside your boy. If I tell her the truth, Edmond said, Julian dies a failure in her eyes. The one thing of his I have left to protect is the way she remembers him. And if you don't tell her, Whitfield answered, you die a villain in them. And the boy's memory loses the one champion left who can prove the truth in a court. He let that settle. There's no clean way out of a thing you built crooked, Edmond. Only an honest one. You can keep your son's pride or your own, but I don't think the post you're holding lets you keep both. He rose, joints cracking. Choose which corpse you're defending. Then defend it like a soldier and stop hiding behind the dead to spare yourself, the saying. It was a hard thing to hear from a friend, and Whitfield had never once softened a hard thing in 40 years of saying them. He left Edmund with the second glass untouched, and the truth laid bare on the table beside the cuttings. Two kinds of evidence: the lie his cousin had planted and the confession his own pride refused to make. Edmund stood at the window a long time. Outside, the home park lay gray and waiting, the last snow gone to mud, the sky the color of an old wound. He thought of the boy in the portrait. He thought of the letter on his table. Forgive yourself the years you spent too proud to come. He understood, dimly and too late as always, that his son had foreseen this exact failure in him, had written the cure into the letter itself, and that Edmund was at this very moment proving the diagnosis correct. I will tell her, he said aloud, to the empty room, to the dead boy, to the cure he could not yet swallow. Tomorrow, when I have found the words that spare him, but there is no tomorrow promised to any man, least of all the ones who keep deferring their courage to it. He did not know, standing at that window rehearsing a confession he meant to make in his own good time, that the moor was already gathering its strength in the north and west, that the temperature was already falling, that the post he believed he held in quiet would within hours become the most desperate action of his long career. He believed he had until morning. He had in truth only until dark, and dark, on the high fells in the dead heart of winter, comes fast and brooks no appeal. The weather chose that night to remind every soul under the roof that the moor answered to no man's grief and kept no man's schedule. It came down off the high fells without warning, the way the worst of them always did, the temperature falling like a stone down a well, the wind climbing from a moan to a scream. By the middle of the evening, the snow drove so thick that a lantern held at arm's length showed nothing but a churning wall of white. The road south went first, then the track to the village. Then the world itself shrank to the single ring of firelight where the household gathered, and listened to the old house take its beating like a ship laboring in a gale. And it was that night of every night the calendar held that Cordelia's pains began. She was not near her time. That was the first terror. She came down the great stair, white to the lips, gripping the rail, weeks early at the very least, and a single look passed between her and Mrs. Beswick that needed no translation and told Edmund everything he could bear to know. We need the doctor, the old woman said. The doctor was 9 miles off across a moor that had just erased its own roads. Edmund went to the window. The white wall stared back at him, indifferent. 9 miles in this, he said, is a death sentence for whoever I send, and meant his own life as much as the rider's. Then we manage without him, Cordelia gasped, one hand white on the banister, the other pressed hard to the child. As women have, the whole length of history, before there was ever a doctor to send for. Her chin came up even as a wave of it bent her double. I did not outlast that churchyard, she said through her teeth, to lose this to a snowstorm. Get me upstairs. There is a thing that happens to certain men when the open ground turns to chaos around them. The clutter of pride and grief and the 100 small daily fears burns clean away, and what remains is the cold true engine they were built around. Edmond Ashby had not felt that engine turn over in 15 years. He felt it catch now. The terror did not leave him. He simply set it down, the way he had once set down terror under fire, and lifted instead the only thing that mattered, which was the next order to be given. Whitfield, the fires in the east chamber, every one of them. I want that room warm enough to bake bread by midnight. Mrs. Beswick, you have caught children before. You hold command above stairs, and I will hear no argument on it. He was already moving, already taking the steps to set a stride in a way no man of his years had any right to. He turned on the white-faced stable boy hovering in the hall. You do not ride for the doctor. You'll be dead in the first drift and cost us a horse besides. You go on foot, by the wall line, hand over hand, post to post, all the way to the village. You bring back any woman who has ever caught of a baby living, and you do not let go of that wall for anything God or the devil offers you. Now run, the boy ran. The night became a war, and Edmond Ashby, who had spent his whole life fighting to carry men out of the world, fought one at last to carry a soul into it. They would not let him in the room, of course. So he stood the watch outside it instead, the way he had stood 1,000 watches in 100 worse places, feeding the corridor brazier, hauling up the kettles Mrs. Beswick called for, and listening through a slab of oak to sounds that did to his nerves what no enemy gun had ever quite managed. The hours stacked up, the candles burned to stubs, and he set fresh ones. The storm flung itself at the towers, and he gave it no more notice than he would a distant skirmish. And in the long, terrible silences between Cordelia's cries, he did a thing he had not done in decades. He prayed. Not the smooth, dutiful prayers of a man in a pew, the raw, graceless, bargaining prayers of a man with nothing left in the stores but himself. "Take what's left of me," he told the dark beyond the window. "The name, the title, whatever years I have, only let her live. Let them both live. I have put enough of this family in the ground to last me whatever forever I'm owed." Whether anything heard him, he never learned. But near the blackest hour of that black night, as the storm's fury finally began to spend itself against the fells, a new sound came through the oak, thin, furious, outraged at the cold, rude world it had been dragged into, the sound of a child who had decided against every odd the night had stacked against it to live. The door opened. Mrs. Beswick stood in it, gray with exhaustion, her sleeves shoved to the elbow, and on her face a look Edmund would carry to his own grave. "A boy, my lord," she said, and her voice cracked clean down the middle. "A son. Both of them living. Both of them stubborn past all sense. The Lord help this house for it." He went in. Cordelia lay spent, and somehow luminous against the pillows, and in her arms, wrapped in linen that had waited 2 generations for an heir to fill it, was a red and furious scrap of a thing with a shock of dark hair and 2 small fists already raised against creation, exactly as his father had raised his, exactly as his grandfather still did. She looked up at him. The anger of the morning room had not vanished, but she had set it aside, the way one sets aside a quarrel for a thing that matters more. "Would you?" she said, and could not finish, and did not need to. He took the child. His hands, which had not been wholly steady in months, were steady now, and he held the entire future of an ancient name in the crook of one old arm. 40 years, he said, very low, to no one and to the boy and to the dead son who should have stood where he stood. 40 years I made a name out of dead men, and here it is at last. Breathing. He touched one impossibly small fist with one scarred finger, and the fist, with the easy tyranny of the newly born, closed around it and would not give it back. "They can stand in every court in the kingdom," he murmured, "and swear this child is nothing." He looked down at the living, squalling weight of him. Let them try it to his face. For 1 hour, holding his grandson while the storm guttered out and an exhausted gray crept up the glass, Edmund let himself believe the worst was behind them. He had forgotten the iron box on his table. He had forgotten the papers he had been too broken to read. And he had forgotten the oldest law of his trade, the one he had drilled into 1,000 young men and somehow never learned for himself. That the enemy does not wait for you to be ready, that he strikes, always, in the 1 hour you let yourself believe the fighting is done. The hammering at the great front door came just after first light. Not the village, not the doctor, days too late to matter. A rider in Crane's livery, half frozen to his saddle, who had clearly been told to come through the storm or not come back at all, and who thrust into the butler's hands a single document weighted with the seal of a London court. Edmund came down the stair with his grandson's first cry still warm in his ears and broke the wax standing in the cold of his own hall. He read it once. Then a second time, more slowly, the way a man reads ground that has just been mined beneath him. They had not waited for the child to draw breath before moving to declare he had no right to. The summons named Cordelia. It named the boy, not a full day old, the ink on the writ older than the infant it sought to disinherit. It commanded the family to appear before the ecclesiastical court and answer the suit of Tobias Crane. Who held, the document said, proof that no lawful marriage had ever joined Julian Ashby to the woman now styling herself his widow. No valid union, no legitimate issue, no heir. The line dies with your son. Crane's churchyard sentence, taken up, drawn out, fitted with teeth, and made into law with a newborn laid across the jaws of it. Edmund stood very still. Behind him, somewhere above, he could hear Mrs. Beswick's head tread, and the thin new wail of the child, the 2 sounds of a life beginning. In his hands he held the cold machinery of an attempt to end that life before it had properly started. "What is it?" Cordelia called down, her voice frayed thin from the night. She had risen too soon. She stood at the head of the stair with one hand on the rail, and the other still curved, by instinct, where the child had been. He almost lied to her. The old reflex rose, the urge to fold the paper away, and carry this too off into his private corner, to spare her, to manage it alone. And then he heard her own words from the carriage, weeks and a lifetime ago. Words become law if no one stands in their road. He had promised to stand in it. He had failed that promise twice already, in the morning room and at the window. He would not fail it a 3rd time on the morning his grandson was born. A summons, he said, from the court. He climbed the stairs and put the paper into her hand, because she had earned the right to read it with her own eyes. "They mean to call the boy a fraud and you a liar, and they have set a date to do it." She read it. He watched the last of the night's exhausted softness leave her face and something harder take its place. something he recognized because he had spent his life among men who wore it before a fight they did not expect to survive but meant to make costly. "When can they do this?" she said. "He's an hour old, within the fortnight by the look of it. They drew this before he was even born. They were never going to give him a chance to be real first." Cordelia lowered the paper. She looked at him, and there was no softness in it and no plea, only a flat, terrible directness. "Then I will ask you once more, my lord, and this time you will answer me true, because there is no longer time for anything else." She did not raise her voice. "Whatever it is you have been carrying since the morning room, whatever sent you over the water, is it a weapon or is it a wound? Because if it is a weapon, I need it now. And if it is only a wound, then God help us both, because that paper says we have nothing else." And somewhere above them, on a table in a room he had not entered in 3 days, in an iron box he had been too broken to open to its bottom, lay the one thing in all the world that could prove the cousin a liar. Edmond simply did not yet know it was already in his keeping. The summons did not let him sleep, and for once he was grateful, because a man who cannot sleep has all the long hours of the dark to think, and Edmond spent them climbing back at last toward the one thing he had been too hollowed out to face. The iron box on his table, the papers he had carried up from his son's sealed study, and then could not bring himself to read, because the letter had taken everything and left nothing over for the cold business of ink and seals. There was something left over now. Rage will do that for a man. It fills the empty stores back up, and it is not particular about what it fills them with. He lit every candle in the room until the dark had nowhere left to stand. He opened the box, and this time he did not stop at the letter. He laid the documents out across the table in the gray hour before dawn, one beside the next, and read them the way he had once read maps before a battle, hunting not for comfort, but for ground he could hold and hills he could fight from. The first page stopped his breath. A marriage license, properly drawn, granted under a bishop's surrogate, naming Julian Ashby and Cordelia by their full names, dated and sealed 3 days before the country wedding that Crane swore had never lawfully taken place. Beside it lay the marriage lines themselves, signed by the couple, signed by 2 witnesses, signed at the foot by the curate who had joined them, and clipped behind both, in that same curate's careful hand, a sworn deposition setting down the whole ceremony in detail, written, the man had noted in a steady postscript, against the day some person of bad faith should attempt to unmake what God had joined, Julian had known. That was the truth that rose up out of the candlelight and took Edmond by the throat. His son had foreseen this exact morning, had foreseen a grasping cousin and a tampered register, and a young widow called a liar over an open grave, and had armored his wife and child against all of it before he died, and had locked that armor inside an iron box that would open to one word and one man. Forgive, not a plea then, never a plea, a trust. The boy had placed in his faithless father's hands the single weapon that could save everything he loved, and had staked his family's whole future on a wager that Edmond, in the end, would prove worth it. There was more. A deed of mortgage on the free estate, his own signature heavy at the foot of it, raised against his unentailed lands for a sum so large the figure seemed to lower the temperature of the room. And the settlement that went with it, the whole grim arithmetic laid out in a clerk's neat columns. The debts Julian had drowned beneath. The Paris house that had bought them up at rates built to swallow a man whole. The terms by which one E. Ashby, Earl of Ravenscar, had quietly purchased his son's entire ruin out of foreign hands and into his own, telling no one, asking, so that the world would never learn. The boy had failed and the boy would never learn. His father had bled himself near white to spare him the shame of it. And last of all, beneath everything, Julian's true will, short, plain. Everything that had been his to give, given to his wife and the child she carried. And a final line that Edmond read 3 times and then could not see at all because his eyes had gone and betrayed him. To my father, who I pray will read this in time, I leave the one thing he never once let me give him, my forgiveness, freely. He was always braver than he was kind. I hope before the end he learns the second. Edmond sat in the wreckage of his own pride, with the proof of his innocence and his son's loves spread before him like a hand he had been holding all along without the wit to play it. He had spent a whole grieving season mourning a boy who had reached back across the very grave to save him. The shame of that was, very nearly worse than the grief, but only very nearly. Because beneath the shame, for the first time since a horse had thrown his son on a southern road, Edmond Ashby felt something with an edge to it. He had a wound, Cordelia had asked, or a weapon. He looked at the documents arranged across the table in their cold, precise, undeniable rows, the work of a son who had loved his father enough to plan his rescue. And he understood that the answer, Against every expectation was both. The wound had become the weapon. Julian had made it so. All that remained was for his father to be, at the 11th hour, the man the boy had bet on. Edmond gathered the pages with hands that no longer shook. Then he went to find the girl, because this was a thing he would not carry alone, not for 1 hour more. He found her at first light in the nursery, the child at her breast, exhaustion and ferocity sharing her face, the way they share the face of every new mother in the first raw morning. She did not look up when he entered. She had not forgiven the morning room, and she was right not to have. "I have something to show you," he said. And then, because the season of the proud silence was finished, finally and forever, he made himself amend it. "No, that is the wrong word, and I have hidden behind wrong words my whole life. I have something to confess to you. The two have always been the same thing in me, and I have spent decades pretending otherwise." She looked up then. He laid it before her, but not the documents first. The truth first, in his own voice, which was by far the harder thing to produce, that Julian had not been the careless casualty of a cold father's neglect, but the object in the end of that father's last clumsy secret love. That the woman in Paris was a creditor, and nothing more, a holder of debts, not a holder of his heart. That every coin the gossips swore he had squandered had gone to buy his son's ruin back before the world could feed on it. That he had been over the water performing exactly that rescue in the very week Julian rode north to forgive him, and that he would carry the cruelty of that crossing, the two of them passing in the dark into his own grave and beyond it. "Why?" Cordelia whispered. "Why not simply say so? In the morning room. You would have kept me as your ally instead of forcing me into your judge." "Because to clear my own name," Edmond said, "I had to stain his, and I had stained that boy enough while he lived. I would not do it now he's past defending himself." He set the documents gently into her free hand. "So I let you think me a villain rather than make his grave a place of shame. It was the wrong choice. I have made the wrong choice every important time it was offered to me, for the same reason every time. I called my silence strength. It was only ever fear in a better coat. The anger went out of her then, the way air leaves a wound when the pressure finally breaks. She looked down at the pages he had given her, at her own marriage lines, at her husband's will,
Everything is
at the
bitter.
cold witnessed, sealed proof that the child asleep against her was no bastard, and no fraud but the lawful last hope
Is
of an
bitter.
old and ancient house. And she wept. But these were not the tears of the churchyard,
And
nor of the courtyard in
sunrise
the
is
rain.
cold enough.
These were the tears of a woman discovering that the man she had condemned had been at her side the entire
And
time,
the sun is gone.
and had let her hate him sooner than disgrace the dead.
Gray.
"You stubborn, ruinous old man," she said, and it was the most affectionate
day
thing
is
anyone
gone.
had called him in 20 years.
To
We
turn
could have
away.
carried all of this together from the very first day. "We can carry it together now," he answered.
In the night
And for the first
winds
time in his
blow,
life, the words were not a deflection or an excuse or a
in the
soldier's
morning
lonely creed.
glow,
They were a promise, and he meant to keep this one.
in the dark,
There are more of us than there are of him, Cordelia.
gold.
We have only been losing because we kept fighting, as though each of us stood alone. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, a brisk, practical gesture. And when she looked up again, the widow and the new mother had been joined by a third thing, harder than either, an ally. "Then tell me the ground," she said, throwing his own old word back at him. "Tell me what these pages can do and what they cannot. Tell me where he is strong and where we can break him. Because that child is going to grow up in a house with his father's name carved over the door, and I will see every man who tried to take it from him answer for it first." And Edmond Ashby, who had commanded armies and lost the only war that ever truly mattered to him, looked at his son's widow across his son's child, and felt for the first time since a coffin went into the ground at St. Alden's, not grief, and not shame, but the clean, cold readiness of a man who has finally found his ground and the people worth holding it for. He sat, he spread the pages, and he began at last to plan the battle as if he believed he could win it. The court would not wait on a reconciliation, however hard won. The suit was set for a fortnight hence, before the ecclesiastical bench at Doctors' Commons, where the validity of a marriage was a matter learned men in robes, settled over Latin and parchment, a world away from any war or any grave. Edmond did not travel to it alone, and that in the end was the whole of the difference. He took the iron box, sealed and bound, and never once out of his sight, the documents riding south locked against his own ribs. He took Whitfield, whose single eye had been quietly busy these many weeks in ways Edmond was only beginning to measure, and he took the curative himself, the very man whose hand had signed the lines, run to ground at last in his small northern parish, and brought along, willing and plain-spoken, to swear before the court to what he had done. But Tobias Crane had not built a siege of his patience on guesswork. He kept watchers of his own, and word reached him soon enough that the old earl had gone south, guarding a strong box the way a man guards a third lung. A man with nothing to fear does not nurse an iron box across 200 miles of winter road. Crane understood then that somewhere in that box lay the thing that could undo everything he had spent so carefully. And a man like Crane does not meet such a thing across a courtroom if he believes he can reduce it to ash in the dark first. So the fire came to Ravenscar 3 nights before the hearing, with the master and his proof already long gone south. The men Crane sent came over the moor wall in the black hour, and they did not come to rob. They came to erase. They put their torches to the east wing first, to the old study where they had been told the earl hoarded his papers, and the ancient timbers, dried through a season of moonlit fire, took the flame the way dry timber always does, with terrible enthusiasm. But Crane had aimed his torch at a position the enemy had already abandoned. Edmond had not left a single page behind him. The study they burned was an empty room, its treasure 200 miles to the south, locked against the ribs of the one man it was made to save. They crossed a winter moor to destroy a proof that had already left the house in its master's coat. Mrs. Beswick smelled the smoke before any bell could ring it, and the woman who had kept a dead house breathing for 15 lonely years was not about to surrender it to hired torches without a fight. She roused the household. She set the grooms to the well chain and the bucket line, and when a young footman cried that the east wing was lost and they should think of their own skins, she rounded on him with a fury that froze him where he stood. This house buried its mistress and waited 15 winters for a reason to stand up again. I will not let some grasping London cousin's torch have the last word on it. Now pull. They could not save the east wing. By dawn, it was a blackened skeleton open to a hard white sky, the study where Julian had spent his last hopeful week, reduced to ash and fallen beam. But they saved the rest, every other stone of it, and they did one thing more. One of Crane's men, overcome by the very smoke he had helped to raise, was hauled half dead from the courtyard by Edmund's grooms and bound in the kitchen until he was fit to talk. And talk he did in time, for a man facing a noose for arson grows suddenly generous with the name of whoever paid him. The road from that man's pocket led, as Whitfield's quiet inquiries had already mapped it, straight back to the purse of Tobias Crane. Crane had wanted to be rid of the proof. Instead, in his haste, he had manufactured a second crime, a far blacker one than forgery, and handed his enemy a living witness to it. He had burned a house to silence a box that was no longer in it, and lit, in doing so, the fire that would consume him. Word of it all reached Edmund in his London lodgings on the eve of the hearing, carried by an exhausted rider, and the old general read it twice and set it down and allowed himself, for the first time in that whole long winter, something close to a grim and soldierly smile. The enemy had broken cover, the enemy had made a mistake, and Edmond Ashby had spent a lifetime learning exactly what to do with an enemy's mistake. The court convened in a paneled hush, beneath the watchful portraits of long-dead bishops, in a chamber where the dignity of the law was measured in the depth of the silence. Tobias Crane walked in believing he held a winning hand, and did not yet know that the table itself had been turned over beneath him in the night. He played his cards with all his old smoothness. He produced the parish register, and there, where the record of the marriage should have stood, was a clean and telling absence. A page lifted and replaced so neatly that only an honest eye would ever have caught the seam. He spoke at length, and with great feeling, of his painful duty, of his tender concern for the dignity of an ancient name, of the tragedy of a grieving girl deceived into believing herself a wife. A marriage that no register records, he told the bench, is in the eye of the law no marriage at all. The law is not cruel, it is merely exact. And he turned, as he always turned, to let the gallery admire his reluctance. There is no proof before this court, he said, that any lawful union ever existed. There is only the word of an interested widow and the sentiment of an old soldier whose own affairs, I regret to observe, are hardly a model of probity. It was beautifully done. For 10 minutes it even held. Edmund could feel the bench beginning to lean, the robed men weighing an absence as though absence were itself a kind of evidence, and beside him Cordelia's hand found his and gripped it bloodless. Then it was Edmund's turn. And the old general, who had spent a lifetime fighting on ground chosen by other men, at last chose his own. "My cousin tells this court there is no proof," he began, and his voice filled the chamber the way it had once filled a parade ground at dawn. He says it with great confidence. He has earned that confidence honestly. He has gone to considerable trouble to make it true. He set the iron box upon the table before the bench and opened it. 3 nights passed, men in my cousin's pay, crossed a winter moor, and burned my house to the ground for the single purpose of destroying what I am about to lay before this court. He let the silence absorb that. I would ask the court to consider why a man so very certain that no proof exists would trouble to send arsonists across the country to be rid of it. Then he laid it out, page by page, in the plain, unhurried manner of a man who has nothing to hide and everything to prove. He laid out the license granted under a bishop's surrogate, dated and sealed. He laid out the marriage lines, signed and witnessed. He set the curate in the witness chair, and the small, honest northern clergyman swore, in language no Latin could improve upon, that he had joined Julian Ashby and Cordelia by lawful license, before God and 2 living witnesses, on the very day Crane had sworn nothing whatever had occurred. He produced the curate's own deposition, written years before against this exact hour, by a man who had foreseen this exact lie. And as the absence in the register turned, line by line, from a convenient silence into the loud accusation of a tampered page, Edmond watched the famous smoothness drain out of his cousin's face like water from a cracked jug. "You forged an absence," Edmond said, turning on him at last, and called it a fact. "You tore a page out of God's own record because you could not abide what was written there." He let the chamber sit with it. A man who lies to a court is a knave. A man who burns down a house to feed his lie is something this court has a shorter and an uglier word for. He nodded toward the great doors, where Whitfield stood with the captured arsonist beside him, recovered now and entirely willing to trade his master for his own neck. "And I have brought that word into the building with me, that the court need not take it on my temper alone. It came apart for Tobias Crane the way such things always come apart for men who build on rot, not slowly but all at once." The arsonist's testimony bound the fire to Crane's purse. Crane's purse traced down every channel Whitfield had been mapping since the funeral, bound the slander and the bribed register clerk and the whole patient machine of it back to a single, grasping hand. The bench, which had begun the morning weighing a widow's word against a gentleman's reluctance, found itself by noon weighing a curate's sworn oath and a bishop's seal and a license against a forger and an arsonist. There was, in the end, no weighing left to do. The marriage was pronounced good and lawful in every particular. The child was declared the true and legitimate heir of the house of Ravenscar, and Tobias Crane, who had come to that chamber to bury a name, was led out of it under guard to answer for forgery and for arson both, his ruin arriving, as ruin so often does, tailored exactly to the measurements he had taken for another man. Cordelia did not cheer. She bowed her head over the documents, over her husband's hand, reaching across the grave to keep his family whole, and when she lifted her face, she looked first not at the bench, nor at the scattering spectators, but at Edmond. "They never knew," she said softly, "what kind of man you were. They judged the silence and called it the whole story." "Let them," he answered. "We know now. That is the only court whose verdict I ever truly needed. There was a thing that happened in the weeks after, quietly, with none of the law's noise about it, and it mattered more than any verdict. Edmond Ashby went home to a half-burned house and did not grieve it. He stood in the black ruin of the east wing, in the ash where his son had spent his last hopeful days, and instead of sealing the door and walking away the way he had sealed away every grief of his life, he gave the order to rebuild, not to restore, to rebuild. Something new raised up out of the burned place. And when the masons asked what was to stand where the ruined study had been, Edmond surprised them, and surprised himself rather more. "A library," he said. "The light let in from the south, room enough for every book a man could want and every canvas a man could paint." He thought of a portfolio of sketches that had not come through the fire, of a winter moor caught in charcoal by a hand that had loved it, and his voice roughened against his will. "Make it a place a young man could be happy in. We ran short of those in this house once. We will not run short again." They cut his instruction into the white stone above the door, and Edmond chose the words himself and stood beneath them a long while when the carvers were done. For the man who built everything and asked for nothing. It was not meant for Edmond. He had asked for a great deal in his time and given grudgingly. It was for the boy who had asked only to be seen and been met with silence and had forgiven that silence anyway from a place beyond the reach of any thanks. The child grew through that first spring and into summer the way children do, loud and astonished and tyrannical, and Edmond, who had been a stranger to his own son's boyhood, refused to be one to his grandson's. He learned the small creatures every weather. He carried him out across the moor and named the hills aloud as his wife had once named her flower beds. And, when the naming was, he came at last to understand a kind of prayer, the only one he had ever known how to mean, and when the boy, in the slow alchemy by which infants arrive at their first words, fixed his fierce dark eyes on the old man one perfectly ordinary morning and produced, against all the dignity of an earldom, a sound that was unmistakably reaching for a name no child his age had any business knowing: Edmond Ashby, who had received the thanks of a grateful nation and the surrendered swords of beaten generals, sat down on the cold stone step and found he could not speak at all. Cordelia watched from the doorway. "He has decided who you are," she said. "Children do that. They don't read the gossip. They just look at who keeps showing up." "Then I will keep showing up," Edmund managed when he had command of his voice again. "It is the one campaign I waited far too long to join." He looked at the boy, at the squirming, furious future of an old name, at the impossible second post a man is almost never granted and never deserves. "I missed his father's whole life standing guard over a word carved in stone." He held the child closer. "I would trade every honor I own for one more morning to have done that differently. So I will spend whatever is left of me making certain this one never wonders. Not for a single day whether he is loved. He will be heartily sick of hearing it, and here, at the end, is the thing worth carrying away from a story like this one, long after the names and the dates have worn smooth. Edmond Ashby was not a villain, and not, by the hard measure of his hard times, even a bad man. He was a man who confused his silence for strength, his pride for protection, and his sense of duty for the love it was only ever standing in front of. The whole world looked at that silence and read coldness in it. They looked at his long absence and read betrayal. They looked at an old soldier's stiff reserve and read a confession of guilt. And the whole world was wrong, every drawing room and every planted paragraph of it, because the whole world had judged the quiet and never once asked what the quiet was holding. He had nearly let it cost him everything. He had let it cost him his son outright. The boy died with his hand still reaching across a gap his father waited too long to close, and no verdict, no rebuilt house, no late arriving wisdom would ever open that particular door again. Some doors do not reopen. That is the plain hard truth at the center of it, and the story would be a lie if it pretended otherwise. But forgiveness came anyway, in its own crooked time. It came carved on a key and folded into a letter and locked in an iron box against the very fire meant to destroy it. It arrived too late for the one who had needed it most, and just in time for the one who had to learn to go on living with having failed him. And that, perhaps, is the truest mercy any of us has ever offered. Not the chance to undo what we have done, only the chance to become, before our own end, the man we should have been the whole way along. Edmond Ashby lived 11 more years. He spent them in a house full of southern light, beneath an inscription meant for a son he had wronged, raising a grandson who never once in his life had cause to doubt that he was wanted. He never recovered the years he had lost to his own pride. No man ever does, but he saw to it, every single day he had left, that the name he had guarded so jealously and so long would mean, to the one child who would carry it next, not duty and not silence. And not a cold study walled in maps and medals, but something far harder for an old soldier to give, and far more worth the giving. A father who finally learned how to stay, and a door that stood, from that winter forward, always unlocked.